April 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. Allied and Canadian armies cross the Rhine and strike deep into Germany. But the 1st Canadian Corps is given the task of mopping up a German army, the remnants of the Nazi Reich in Holland. With the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment crossing into Holland is Major Harry Hamley.
We had the toughest battle of my experience. Zutphen, a pretty town on the Dutch-German border. To a veteran, it awakens a nightmare. For here we slugged out our last big fight with fanatical Nazis, now fighting with desperation like cornered rats. I buried over 20 men in Zutphen.
This is the Canadians' bridge in Zutphen, Holland. Zutphen was one of hundreds of Dutch towns and villages that were liberated by the Canadians in April 1945. The fighting here was quite severe, as the German defenders were mostly young German fanatics, Hitler Youth, 14, 15-year-old boys who just refused to give up. In fact, it wasn't until the North Shore Regiment brought in the flamethrowers that they finally cleared the town on April 8, 1945. This was typical of the actions of the Canadians until the end of the war. Small fights, 30 men, 20 men killed here and there, and finally they lost 1,400 before the end of the war. But they did liberate Holland.
Two weeks after Zutphen, the fighting in Holland ends. And on May 5th, 1945, General Charles Fuchs of the 1st Canadian Corps accepts the surrender of all German forces in Holland. Holland is free. In one of the crowds, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the liberators, is 15-year-old Cornelia Fuchshot.
Over the din of happy people, a weird noise was heard. At first it came in waves, barely audible, and I thought at times that I imagined it, but Annie heard it too. The sound grew louder now, and we recognized drums. And then, suddenly, we saw the soldiers themselves who had come this far, fighting up the beach in Normandy, through France and Germany across the Rhine, fighting all the way to liberate us. Not giving up, still coming on, living through hell and dying in it, but never relenting. Marching on until there was no more enemy to stop them. We saw them passing by, more and more of them, and finally it was too much. A cry went up, a shout of pent-up anguish and jubilation, and sheer love after the hatred of 5 years. We could not stop ourselves. We had to be nearer, closer with these men on top of those tanks and cannons and trucks, and what our voices would not be able to tell them, our arms had to do. Our unspeakable gratitude for dispelling the nightmare.
This is Holton Canadian War Cemetery in Holland, and today the Dutch are honoring the men who are buried here, the Canadians killed in the liberation of Holland. This is the grave of Reverend Albert McCreary. He was the chaplain to the Canadian Grenadier Guards Armored Regiment, and he's one of the last Canadians to die in the war. In fact, the ceasefire had taken place in the afternoon of May the 4th, and he decided to go out and help some German wounded, and he never returned. They found his body 2 days later, and it sort of shows the depth of contribution the Canadians made to the war.
The Reverend A.E. McCreary is one of the last of the 40,000 Canadians to die, fighting from the beaches of Sicily and the shores of Normandy to liberate Europe. Europe is in ruins, And when, as victors, the Canadians enter defeated Nazi Germany, they discover horrors that they had not even imagined. Just a few days after the war ends, Canadian war artist Alex Colville is sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany to draw what he sees.
I made a drawing of some women, dead from starvation and typhus, lying outside one of the huts. While I drew, a group of bodies was added too, and more people died and were feebly dragged out of the huts. This being in Belsen was strange. That is, seeing one dead person is bad. But seeing 500 dead people is not 500 times worse. There's a certain point at which you begin to feel nothing.
In Europe, the war is over. The shadow of Nazi tyranny has been banished. The Germans had fought to the end, until their whole country had been reduced to ruins. 3 months later, it seems that the other great Axis power, Japan, will also fight to the end. On August 6, 1945, an Allied bomber drops an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 70,000 Japanese die. But Japan does not surrender, and Allied bombing attacks continue.
This is Onagawa Bay, Japan. It's about 300 kilometers north of Tokyo, and it was here that Hampton Gray of Nelson, British Columbia, won the Second World War's last Victoria Cross.
Serving with the British fleet just off Japan are dozens of Canadians. Among them is a 25-year-old pilot, Robert Hampton Gray. 3 days after Hiroshima, Robert Hampton Gray takes off leading a squadron of Corsair aircraft in an attack on the Japanese Navy. Their target, the destroyer Amakusa, sheltering in Onagawa Bay, is protected by a deadly ring of anti-aircraft guns in the hills around the bay.
We're on the seawall in the middle of Onagawa Bay, and of course on the morning of August 9, 1945, the HMS Formidable had sent out a formation of 8 Corsairs to attack the Amakusa right here. Now, of course, the Japanese could see this formation of 8 Corsairs approaching from the Pacific, which is just behind us over here. Then they could actually watch the 8 of them form around in a circle because they're going to pick the best vantage point for attack. They could watch the Corsairs disappear as they went behind the mountains around here and circle the mountain over here behind Onagawa and come in low from the position right between the 2 hills. So you can well imagine this right here, that the destroyers set up and those Corsairs are coming out of those hills, they're low, and all hell would break loose. The ship was hit at this point with the 500-pound bomb. It exploded, and then of course it blew up again when it hit the ammunition stores. Gray himself was hit on the way in, and his Corsair caught fire, and he plunged into the bay just over there. Hampton Gray did not survive the crash, and he was later awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his efforts on August 9th, 1945.
Robert Hampton Gray is the last Canadian to be killed in combat in the Second World War.
2.5 hours after Gray's attack here, the Americans dropped their second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and finally the Japanese were forced to sue for peace. On August 15, 1945, they surrendered, and after 6 long years, the Second World War was finally over.
Japanese imperial power has come to an end. But somewhere in the ruins of Japan are tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war. Among them, 1,400 Canadians. Now, finally, their fate will be known.